In the United States and New Zealand, and to a certain extent in Canada, direct-to-consumer advertising of prescription drugs is actually legal, and that includes statins. But is it really in the public interest? Well, let's take a look at that. Stay tuned. So even if you're not from one of the areas where such advertising is legal, you may find it interesting to find out how it affects us where it is legal and how it may affect you in the future if it becomes legal there. So first of all, I should explain why I use the term snake oil. Why do I compare selling statins to snake oil? So let me give a little bit of a history of snake oil in the United States. Snake oil first came over to the U.S. with the immigrant Chinese railroad workers who worked on the transcontinental railroad, and it was made from Chinese water snakes. And it actually had a legitimate medicinal purpose. The snake oil was rich in omega-3 EPA, and it acted as a balm for sore and aching muscles, and the workers would have that after a long day of work. Of course, what happened in the United States, some entrepreneurs decided that they wanted to start selling snake oil. And they didn't have any Chinese water snakes, so they took local rattlesnakes and they used them instead. Unfortunately, the local rattlesnakes did not have oil that was high in omega-3 EPA, so this was not as effective. So eventually, snake oil, it was touted as a cure for everything because it wasn't really helping too much with the aching muscles, so they had to sell it for something, so it became synonymous with fraudulent medicines. Now, many of you may think that I'm being kind of harsh by comparing statin selling to snake oil sales. I get where you're coming from on that, and all I can do is really apologize to the hardworking snake oil salesman. I'm not really meaning to insult them by making this comparison. It's just, I think, a comparison that I needed to make. So let's talk about these direct-to-consumer ads. When they first came out in the United States, I noticed them, I don't know, it was about 20 years ago, I guess. I was actually pretty amazed because usually the ads would say something naming the product. They wouldn't say what it was for. They would say, ask your doctor if taking this will be appropriate for you. I thought that kind of weird. Like, I'm just going to go to my doctor and say, hey, doc, I want to know if this random pill will help me. But what they were really doing, this was a concerted effort to get us into a certain mindset. And that mindset is, there's a pill out there for anything that's wrong with you, things that you don't even know are wrong with you. So you better go check it out. That's what they were getting at. And then as time went on, they actually started talking about what the individual pills were supposed to be for. But they had to kind of establish that mindset first, a pill for every ill. There was research done by Cornell University. These researchers looked at data on adults who were watching these commercials, and they did find that seeing the ads on statins did increase statin usage by 16 to 22%. Unfortunately, the people who started getting statin prescriptions from watching the ads were at low risk of heart disease. It actually promoted overdiagnosis of high cholesterol and overtreatment for populations where risk of statin use may outweigh potential benefits. This is the first time I've seen a mainstream researcher actually acknowledge that the risks may outweigh the potential benefits. If your cardiovascular risk is low, then the risk of taking a statin can outweigh the benefits, especially when you take into account adverse effects. There was a review of this research where they said this study supports the hypothesis that drug ads do indeed increase disease awareness and treatment, but not among the individuals most likely to benefit. They go on to say here, direct-to-consumer advertising promotes needless and possibly harmful prescribing. I think that's important to note. So while I was researching this video, I just so happened to go to a bookstore and I found this book. The name of it is Sickening, and it's by Dr. John Abramson, and the subtitle is How Big Pharma Broke American Healthcare and How We Can Repair It. This is a legitimate doctor. He is actually called in as an expert witness on some of the largest lawsuits against pharmaceutical companies that have resulted in the largest record-breaking fines. This is not just some YouTube hack who's got a grudge against statins. This is an actual, very well-respected expert in this subject. Now, he does have a chapter on statins. I have not completed the book, but I recommend it to anybody from what I've seen from the first 5 chapters that I have read, and maybe I'll do a review on it when I'm done. But let's take a look at the excerpt from the Amazon review of it, where they say, one of Pharma's best kept secrets is that peer reviewers charged with ensuring the accuracy and completeness of the clinical trial reports published in medical journals do not even have access to the complete data. A lot of my viewers have pointed this out in the comments saying, we don't even get to see the real data. The people who are reporting on it they don't get to see the real data. And most importantly here, experts who write the clinical practical guidelines that define our standards of care are doing so without even seeing the actual data, without going through the filter of the marketing departments of the pharmaceutical companies. And in fact, Dr. Abramson points out in his book that in many cases, those who wrote the standards of care have financial ties to those pharmaceutical companies. But I think it would be wrong of me not to present an alternate view that, of course, I'm going to trash. Here's one that was actually published on Yale's website, and here's what they said. Pharmaceutical ads drive prescriptions and save us all money. The benefits were staggering. Not only did the monetary value of avoided heart attacks outweigh the amount that pharmaceutical companies spent on statin advertisements over the period of the study, but the gains proved substantial enough to justify all direct-to-consumer advertising. What they did was, in order to see what the impact was on statin sales, they actually looked at what happened to statin sales during election season in the United States. Well, why that? During the election season, candidate ads actually take precedence. It's the number of prescription drug ads being shown actually goes down, and they could look at that and see what the impact was. And sure enough, the impact of the fewer ads is fewer newer prescriptions were being written. But what they didn't take into consideration here is that those prescriptions were among people at low risk. So not many of them were being saved. They accepted the data from the pharmaceutical company without question, it appears, and they just ignored this other very important aspect of it. And they just said, if there's that many fewer statin prescriptions, there must be this many more heart attacks as a result, which is just absolutely ridiculous. Now, this was a study being done by an economist, and clearly he just accepted exactly what the pharmaceutical companies were telling him. But this isn't the worst of it. The most stunning and shocking, and I would have to say sickening sentence I've ever seen in print having to do with statins was this one that I have highlighted in red. The potential side effects of statins are negligible, so we assumed them away. In other words, when doing this cost-benefit analysis, they just ignored adverse effects. So they were negligible. They didn't count. If you saw my video of a few weeks ago, statin intolerance can actually range up to 17%. Statin adverse effects range up to 30% in the scientific literature. To say that you can ignore them completely and combine that with the problem of assuming that the people who aren't taking statins were at high risk when actually those people who weren't taking the statins would be at lower risk, the ones who didn't start prescriptions because they didn't see the ads. This was absolute garbage, and I'm shocked that Yale University would let that onto their website. It actually disgusted me. So what's the point of all my ranting this time? And I know I do rant, but the more I read things like this book by Dr. Abramson, the more cynical I get about it. I used to take a position, statins sometimes might have certain benefits for certain people, and I still believe that to some degree, but a lot fewer than I used to think. So first of all, we have to remember pharmaceutical companies have a fiduciary duty to their stockholders. That means increasing sales by any means. And I think in many cases that means stretching the boundaries of what's ethical. Raw data from the clinical trials? Not shared. Adverse effects? Well, they're minimized, ignored, pushed aside, or even lied about. Your actual benefits? They don't matter. You're a low-risk person, and in theory, your risk of a heart attack will be reduced by 1%. That doesn't matter. You should take it. Your adverse effects? They don't matter unless you die. If you die, well, then the adverse effect matters to them only insofar as that means you're not buying statins anymore. And the mainstream medical establishment supports this. They just accept reports from pharmaceutical companies. They minimize adverse effects. They push them aside. And your doctor is possibly unwittingly propagating the lies. Think about the Samson trial. I had a review on that. Not 1 in 1,000 primary care physicians is ever going to read that with a critical eye. They just read the summary that says 90% of statin adverse effects are nocebo effect, in other words, imaginary. And that is the furthest thing from the truth. I've said before, the nocebo effect undoubtedly does exist to some small degree, but to suggest that it's 90% of all adverse effects, that's not even justified by this study. It was absolute garbage. But it's what's being pushed on us. Let me just summarize this with a quote. Now, I talked to a lot of people, so I don't remember the exact words, but I remember the gist of it. And the person said to me, I don't want to die from high cholesterol, so I'm taking my statins. Now, I wasn't in a circumstance where I could really dig deep and find out what the person's position was. If this person had familial hypercholesterolemia, that means maybe they had a cholesterol level of 400 milligrams per deciliter, which would be about 10.2 millimoles per liter. I can see dying from high cholesterol being a shorthand for my condition, and I don't want to die from it. And in that case, if you don't have side effects from statins, this is one of the very few cases where I think that maybe it is appropriate for a person to consider taking statins. But I have a friend who actually had a level closer to 200 milligrams per deciliter, barely over 5 millimoles per liter. And he actually requested statins from his doctor. No doctor in his right mind would actually refuse a patient request to go on to statins. When I say a doctor in their right mind, one who wants to stay out of trouble with the standards committees and all that sort of thing, I think an ethical doctor who understands it may actually try educating the patient. What this is a microcosm for everything that's wrong with the whole statin debacle. And that is convincing people, convincing the person who said this, that high cholesterol is in and of itself a disease that's got to be treated. Not that it's a marker, which may say, raise your hand and say, maybe we should look a little further. Maybe we should look to see if this is high quality cholesterol, because having a lot of low quality cholesterol is probably a bad thing. But the idea that high cholesterol in and of itself is necessarily an issue, that's what we've been brainwashed to think. There are cases where maybe it is. But my most recent discussion with my doctor, he looked at it and he said, your HDL quality is really high, your LP little a is almost non-existent, and your LDL fractionation says that you have a pattern A LDL. So this really isn't a concern. So high cholesterol, hypercholesterolemia, that's what they call it. They've given it a name, hypercholesterolemia. That scares us into thinking that it's something that needs to be treated without looking any further, without any more nuanced understanding. All they know is cholesterol levels. Sometimes HDL versus LDL, and they categorize HDL as good cholesterol and LDL as bad cholesterol. LDL can be bad cholesterol, but it isn't necessarily. So that's the problem here. This whole idea of advertising to people to get them onto drugs that they don't need in order to make more sales, it's everything that's wrong with the whole situation. So that's what I've got on this topic. Excuse the rant at the end there. If you appreciate this content, please like, share, subscribe, and comment on this topic or others you'd like me to cover. And if you haven't seen this video, I recommend you take a look at it now. Thanks for listening.